to ask the questions in his stead. This is question number 24 by the Senator for Kisumu County, Senator Tom Ojienda SC. Number 1, could the Cabinet Secretary clarify whether the Kenya Defence Forces monitors the security situation within the country and indicate the state of preparedness of the KDF to address potential instability or civilian unrest? Number 2, what are the modalities for the involvement of KDF in internal security matters, and how does KDF balance the internal security needs of the state and the sanctity of civilian lives when dealing with internal instability and unrest? Lastly, Honourable Speaker, what measures has the ministry put in place to ensure that future involvement of KDF in addressing instability or civilian unrest is timely to avert civilian deaths that may arise from the shortcomings of the National Police Service, as was witnessed during the June, July and August 2024 demonstrations? I thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Honourable CS, you may proceed to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me say that I'm glad to be back in this House in my new role as the Cabinet Secretary for Defense. And it's obviously because I like to associate myself with the Senate, having been a member, though very briefly. Mr. Speaker, I'll go straight to responding to the questions raised by Senator Professor Tom Ojienda, Senator for Kisumu County. I will not repeat the questions as have been already espoused by Senator for Nairobi. And Mr. Speaker, I will start by stating that the mandate of KDF as defined in the Constitution is in 3 parts, Mr. Speaker, and I'm making reference to Article 241, 3, A, B, and C of the Constitution. And the 3 parts within which the mandate of KDF is defined, the first one being what is really the primary mandate of the Kenya Defence Forces, is the defense and protection of the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the Republic of Kenya. The other 2 parts, Mr. Speaker, which you will allow me to call secondary mandate of the KDF, is 1, is to assist and cooperate with other authorities in situations of emergency or disaster, and 3, deployment to restore peace, the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces to restore peace in any part of Kenya affected by unrest or instability, and this only happens with the approval of the National Assembly. Mr. Speaker, that is what I will start by bringing to the fore. And whereas the questions asked by the Senator of Kisumu County may look very obvious, I think these are issues which are very pertinent and very of great concern, public concern by Kenyans, because in many instances we have heard Kenyans asking why or how the KDF is deployed with regard to matters of internal security. And to go to the first question on the need to clarify whether KDF monitors the security situations within the country, and we are required to indicate the state of preparedness in KDF address to potential instability or civil unrest. Mr. Speaker, the Kenya Defence Forces is one of the 3 national security organs established under the Constitution. This is in addition to the National Police Service and the National Intelligence Service. And our Constitution does define national security to include the protection against internal and external threats to Kenya's territorial integrity and sovereignty, its people, their rights, freedoms, property, peace, stability, and prosperity, as well as other national interests. So, Mr. Speaker, by dint of that definition, constitutional definition of what national security is, and being that the Kenya Defence Forces are part of the 3 national security organs, therein lies the role of KDF in matters of national security. And whereas the primary responsibility for internal security does lie with other specialized agencies, and these are the National Police Service and the National Intelligence Service, where internal threats to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Kenya arise, the Constitution then makes provision for instances when KDF may be deployed internally. And it therefore follows that for KDF to be effective or to effectively discharge this mandate of involvement in internal security matters, in situational awareness and on internal security issues at all times. And due to the fact that KDF will mainly work in support of other agencies with regard to internal security matters, the force then has to closely collaborate and regularly exchange information with the relevant agencies. Mr. Speaker, again, in response to this question on whether the KDF does monitor internal security matters, when you look at the design of the National Security Council as established by the Constitution, KDF is a member through myself as the Minister for Defense and the Chief of the Defense Forces. And you will know, Mr. Speaker, and the House does know, that the National Security Council does involve all the security agencies and organs of this country, and that therefore mandates KDF to work very closely in coordination and cooperation with other security agencies. We also have the National Security Council Committee, where we have the KDF represented, and this Security Committee is the supportive arm of the National Security Council. And then again, Mr. Speaker, it follows that because of the involvement of KDF in these very crucial national security units, that indeed we have a pulse at each and every aspect of the internal security of the country. Mr. Speaker, and at this point, I will move on to, again for clarity, on the instances of the deployment of KDF under the Article 2413B, which speaks to the collaboration between KDF and other security agencies. An example of this deployment is the Operation Maliza Uhalifu in the North Rift, as well as the North and Eastern Region operation. And of course, of keen interest is the deployment of June 25th, which again falls under Article 2413B, where KDF was deployed to offer support to the National Police Service to deal with the unrest that the country went through at that point. An example of a deployment of KDF to respond to that is Article 241(3)(c), which is to restore peace in any part of Kenya, and this is where the express authority of Parliament has to be sought. An example of that is the Operation Amani Boni, which is currently ongoing. Mr. Speaker, going to question 2, and I will come back to how the KDF operates within these deployments later, but allow me to go to question 2, which is asking on what the modalities for involvement of KDF in internal security matters is. Mr. Speaker, aside from the provisions of the Constitution, we have the Kenya Defence Forces Act, which elaborately enumerates requirements for KDF participation in internal security operations. Under the Constitution, the KDF is strictly bound by the principles of national security as defined under Article 238 of the Constitution, which is they have to be subject to the authority of the Constitution and Parliament, and that the national security activities must be carried in strict compliance with the law and with utmost respect for the rule of law, and that in performance of its functions and exercise of their powers, the KDF shall respect the diverse culture of the communities within Kenya. Mr. Speaker, again on the modalities, under the KDF Act, the Cabinet Secretary at any one time is required to furnish the National Assembly with reports on deployments under Article 241, 3B and C, as I have already stated. And these reports to Parliament are required to have the details as to the reason for deployment, the place and duration of deployment, as well as the expenditure to be incurred. Mr. Speaker, again, where KDF is deployed to restore peace in areas affected by unrest, that is under 241(3)(c, the Chief of the Defense Forces is responsible for the administration, control, and overall superintendence of the operation. But where KDF is deployed in a joint operation in support of the National Police Service and other authorities in situations of emergency, the Inspector General of the National Police Service shall be responsible for the control and overall superintendence of the operations. And again, to bring it closer home, an example of Operation Amani Boni, the Chief of the Defense Forces is responsible for the administration, control, and overall administration. In the other examples given, Operation Maliza Uhalifu in the North Rift, the Inspector General of Police is responsible for the control, and the KDF just comes in to offer support. Mr. Speaker, to focus on internal deployment in support of the National Police Service, other statutory regulations and measures that need to be instituted includes compliance with the constitutional standards, requirement for the Cabinet Secretary to, within 24 hours, issue a notice in the Gazette on the commencement of such deployment, and do the same upon discontinuation. Deployment and discontinuation, again, may be performed only in areas and places where the National Security Council and the President may determine. So the areas of deployment cannot therefore be arbitrary. They are guided by the National Security Council accordingly. There is a code of conduct that must be adhered to, in the which details the operational procedures and regulation of the defense forces. The law also stipulates that in such deployments in support of the National Police Service, the KDF personnel shall have same powers and exercise same duties as those of the National Police Service members. The KDF personnel also are required to undergo prior training before deployment. Mr. Speaker, I'll move to question 3 on what measures the ministry has put in place to ensure that the future involvement of KDF in addressing instability or civilian unrest is timely, to avert death that may arise, and from the shortcomings of the other national security institutions. Mr. Speaker, in response to question 3, the KDF is structured to ensure continuous state of mission readiness, allowing for swift and effective response to both external and internal threats when the need arises. However, in its participation in internal security operations, these are carefully guided by the Constitution and the KDF Act, which specify notifications through gazette notice, authorization to be sought prior to the deployment, and the mandatory reports to be furnished to the National Assembly, and of course, close collaboration and cooperation with the necessary security institutions. Question 4, Mr. Speaker, on how the KDF does balance the internal security needs of the state and the sanctity of civilians' lives when dealing with internal instability or unrest. Mr. Speaker, the involvement of KDF in internal security matters, as I have said, is governed under the Constitution and the law, KDF Act. Section 3 of the Act provides that KDF shall, in fulfilling its mandate, observe and uphold the Bill of Rights, values, and principles under the Constitution in terms of striving for the highest standards of professionalism and discipline among its members. KDF is also to comply with constitutional standards of human rights and fundamental freedoms and dignity, as well as the requirement for sufficient training of staff before such deployments. Mr. Speaker, guided by the aforesaid constitutional and statutory dictates, the KDF is deeply committed to professionalism and operates within customary rules of engagement that prioritize the protection of civilians. And this approach entails the employment of non-lethal methods whenever possible, and the use of minimum force consistent with the achievement of the mission in accordance with the laid out standard operating procedures. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Tom Ojenda, you may ask your 2 supplementary questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a follow-up supplementary question. Let me thank the CS Defense, Madam the Honorable Soipan Tuya, Senator, for the response to the structured questions. However, Mr. Speaker, just one question I want the CS to highlight. No doubt, Mr. Speaker, reference is made to parliamentary approval for intervention.